At this point, it might be interesting to point out a number of significant facts and assumptions that might not be readily apparent.
Okay, well, some of them perhaps are implied in what I've already said before. Although they're outnumbered, the Germans believed that they were so tactically, technically, and I hate to say it, racially superior, that they could easily destroy the Soviet Union and defeat them very quickly. The Germans estimated that the size of the active duty Red Army was about 300 divisions, of which about 200 were well to the west in the area they were about to attack. And that was a good rough estimate of how large the Soviet standing army was, but it makes no allowance for the literally millions of trained reservists that allowed the Soviets to build up units in the depth that the Germans were not even aware of. And in the course of the first 6 months of the war, they created another 300 division equivalents before the Germans could even destroy them before. The poor Soviet performance in the Finnish-Soviet War of 1939-40 simply confirmed sort of those assumptions. Not just Hitler, but all of his generals thought that the Red Army was really incompetent and would be very easy to defeat. And so when they went into the Soviet Union, they weren't even really thinking about mass. It's almost as if there was no real operational or strategic focus to what they were doing, just trying to spread out and occupy the whole territory as if they'd already won. The only people who were not enthusiastic about invading the Soviet Union were the German logistics planners, who had predicted with great accuracy in the fall of 1940 that Germany would get somewhere between 500 and 800 kilometers into the Soviet Union before it ran out of food, fuel, and ammunition. Another assumption is that the Germans expected that the subject peoples of the USSR would welcome them as liberators, so they would not have to counter any general public resistance. So if you add all these assumptions together, what they're saying is they're expecting a short war in which all they have to do is encircle and destroy as much of the active duty Red Army as possible. So to do that, the operational objective in 1941 is a series of major encirclements, which is part of operational doctrine for the Germans anyhow. That in turn they assumed would cause a Soviet political collapse. And then after that, that would solve a lot of their logistical problems. They would not have to send a large army into the depths of the Soviet Union. They could send a relatively small force to sort of pick up the pieces and occupy after things collapsed. If that sounds far-fetched, you need to go back and look at the end of 1917, beginning of 1918, World War I. Once the Soviets had taken over the government of Russia, the Russian army collapsed. And what the Germans expected in 1941 really happened in 1918. They could go anywhere they wanted, and finally the Soviets had to surrender to them. So that was how they were hoping to overcome their logistical limitations. So if you take all these together, looking at those assumptions or expectations, it looks as if the invasion of the Soviet Union is an acceptable risk, maybe even a fairly easy task. It's only when it changes from being a rapid, decisive, short maneuver war into a prolonged attritional struggle that apparently rational risk turns out to be a desperate gamble.
What were some of the considerations for the intelligence preparation of the battlefield?
The biggest thing I think you have to think about here is scale. The Soviet Union represented such a larger area that even if you, that compared to previous campaigns, that even if you leave aside the terrain problems and the Soviet resistance, simply it's not possible to scale up Blitzkrieg from something the size of Poland or France to all of European Russia. Then, as I said, add into this the fact that, and again, I believe the readings point this out, the Soviet Union, Russia even today, has a real shortage of paved roads and effective railroads, which makes it very hard to sustain any kind of in-depth penetration. The sheer distances involved are just sort of mind-boggling. The straight line distance from Warsaw to Moscow is about 1,260 kilometers. The straight line distance to where they wanted to go, to Baku, is twice that, over 2,500 kilometers. So if you take all those things together, it becomes very difficult. So what the Germans set out to do, speaking in terms of the terrain, is to focus most of their efforts north of the Pripyat marshes. The entire Soviet European part of Russia is divided east-west by a great flooded area called the Pripyat Marshes, which reduced roads to mud and everything else. And they had 2 of their 3 army groups, that is groups of armies, operating north of the Pripyat Marshes and only 1 operating to the south in Ukraine.